so much for coming to this Design Leadership book launch. And thank you to friends and colleagues and to people I've just met for your support. I also want to thank the great people at Inform. So Nancy, two Michaels are the people that I've been working with. It's such a fantastic gift to the community to have Inform offer up their space for these kinds of activities. I also, very importantly, want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish people, who have called this landscape, their home for thousands of years and continue to do so today, and we're privileged to be on their land. So many of you represent those who have inspired me along the way. There's former students here, people from government, people from UBC, people from the design community. And I really want to thank everyone who's supported this little venture of design leadership. I was sort of assuming that there might be many designers in the audience. I'm just kind of curious, who kind of self-identifies as a designer? Okay, I know there's a couple of lawyers here, but we'll have to, forgive them. That's right. So, I mean, the book was published by Columbia University Press, but particularly by the Business School Press, and it is pitched a little bit to a business audience because it had to go through the faculty board and the editorial board. But when I think about where I want it to sit in a bookstore, it might initially reside in the business section, but I'd kind of like it to migrate into a much more general audience section, people who might be interested in how they might use design in decision making in their lives. And for designers, I think it's about flexing our leadership muscles, maybe more than we might be intend to do. And so that, I hope, comes through as well. So the book is really about experiencing learning. And hopefully it's about the importance of random inspiration. So I'm not going to read big sections of the book. Instead, I'd like to just tell a few little stories, kind of what's behind the book. So my leadership traits were, I think, ingrained quite early. Some of you know I'm an only child. I was named after my father's favorite Chopin pianist, Moura Quayle, who's English, and no middle name. So my father was a man of very few words, and he said no need for a middle name. So that's why, and from a kind of graphic design perspective, it kind of works, right? Just Moura Quayle. Yeah, so there we go. Thank you, Dad. I do tell stories in the book about my father, who was a clam and oyster biologist. And so he would spend summers up in a place called Pendrell Sound, which is in Desolation Sound. And there's this fantastic photograph of him sitting on a raft with a typical office desk and an old-fashioned, at the time, microscope sitting in the middle of the sound. And what he was doing was really what I would now call knowledge mobilization. He was letting the oyster industry know when the perfect time was to put the shell strings into the water because the oysters were spawning, because the salinity and the temperature was perfect. So he wrote me letters from Pendrell Sound, and one of them is in the book, and he would name the animals, he would give them their Latin names, plants and animals, and he would also assign them names that a 4-year-old could kind of relate to. So I realized that when I was preparing the notes for the book, that really he gave me the gift of an organized approach and an integrated communication style using numbers, words, and pictures. My mother, on the other hand, well, I shouldn't say on the other hand, but my mother was a public health nurse, and I think she contributes to my pracademic tendencies, a word that I try to use at UBC a lot now, because I think that that's what we need in our educational system, people who have a foot in the world outside and a foot in academia. But I think she gave me a sense of adventure and a sense of humor. And she was very concerned about me always having a job. As a result, I could teach piano, I could teach elocution, and she made me take grade 9 typing, which all of us who had to take typing now go, yes, wasn't that a wonderful thing to do? So, but sometimes it takes, what it takes to write a book is to lose a book. So Weed, California has very special meaning to both Dave Fushti, my husband, and me. So this is the triumphant trip up the coast from Berkeley, where I just graduated, and Dave in the silver Datsun King cab with the U-Haul behind, and I'm headed up to my interview at UBC. So we stop at Weed. Anybody been to Weed, California? There we go, yes. So we must have stopped for lunch or something like that. And you know, I'm in the midst of preparing my lecture, right, for my big interview at UBC. And so I must have had and remember, we're talking 1983 here. So this was the only hard copy of the thesis. And I had this big spool from the Unix system that I was clutching, or it was somewhere in the U-Haul. So we get back in the truck and we carry on. And about an hour later, I'm fussing around trying to find some reference. And I say, Dave, where's the thesis? And we look at each other and go, oh, I guess one of us, who knows who, left it on the top of the truck or the U-Haul or God knows where. So it was scattered to the wind in Weed, California, and I was so upset about it, I even put an ad in the paper of Weed, California. If anybody has seen this, anyway. But what I think about a lot is, so on occasion, I'll go on Amazon, and I'll say, I published it. It was published, I should say, by an Arizona publisher in 1984. It's called Idea Book for Teaching Design. And so I go on Amazon. Oh, there's a copy for $1.83. Okay, a used copy, obviously. Someone is kind of going, ugh. But then just before, a couple of weeks ago, I thought, oh, I should check again. It's up to $14.83. But the best part is, so at another event, I was telling this story, and so one of my friends went online and he emailed me and said, Moura, it's now at $17.83. So like it's skyrocketing. Anyway, so that was my book experience. So then, for sure, time and space has intervened, and incredible adventures at UBC. And I guess I really felt that any kind of leadership experience that I'd had, whether it was being a dean or then my privilege of being a deputy minister, that I always used my design mind, that it was always a bit of a design project. You know, God forbid that I would say that to faculty members. No, I would never say, this is a design project, are you in? No. So, but the concept of using the skill set and the mindset of the designer to really help problem solve, shape leadership, bring the necessary tools to bear. So it was really that motivated me. And I was fortunate, those of you who've been following the kind of design thinking trends might be familiar with Jean Lidke's book. She has several books around the connection of business growth and design thinking. And so Columbia University Press was her publisher, so I thought, well, maybe that's where I should send my proposal. And so it really was a great experience working with Columbia, although those of you who've seen the book, there's quite a few sketches in the book, and that was always a fun part of writing the book. So I would try to discipline myself to write and revise, but then the treat would always be I'd get to do a drawing. Like that was, okay, oh, a piper, how wonderful. So one day I got a call from Miles Thompson, who's the publisher of Columbia. He said, Moura, I have good news and I have bad news. I'm like, you don't like the beginnings of those kind of conversations. He said, well, academic presses, they're allowed to be a not-for-profit. They're not allowed to be a loss. Yeah, I get that. He said, so we've had to change printers, and you know how we told you that you can't have a multicolored book. My initial proposal, you can imagine it was like totally multicolored, and I was sort of imagining that Princeton Architectural Press was gonna, not. So they said, okay, you've got one color. So all the drawings were done ink, charcoal, and a splotch of purple, which is one of my favorite colors. So he said, I'm sorry, it's gonna be black and white. We can't do color. I was like, well, okay, can't do color. I can live with that. He said, but the good news is you're going to be allowed to actually have something to say about the interior design of the book. So I thought to myself, you mean I wasn't? you mean this was, somebody else was going to do this without consulting me at all? Which I kind of get. You can imagine, a physicist writing a book and saying, I really want to have a say in what this book looks like. Anyway, so, but it really pointed out the challenge of design if it isn't iterative. So I was given the text, and I had to put in instructions about how big the little drawings would be and where they would be located, but I couldn't do it visually. I had to say, an inch by an inch, and, they had little words for, I had to learn, I've since forgotten, but anyway, how. And so when I saw it in its proof, I was like, oh no, that's too big, this is too small. I mean, no one else will probably see it but me, but anyway. So, so it's been a kind of a fun run. And I mean, the other challenging piece is that Dave has been writing a book at the same time. So two people writing a book in a household, writing different books in a household is sometimes a little challenging. And okay, his has taken a little bit longer than mine, but it's also 5 times the length, so it's probably okay. But he's working on page proofs as we speak, so that's a good thing. But I really want to ask you to let me know what you think about designed leadership, what parts you might find irritating, what parts you like. It is designed for tapas type reading. You don't have to kind of open the first page and kind of plow through. Some people have done that, but I don't advise it. I think it's more interesting to just open it somewhere and start. So I thought, just because it is a book launch, and I guess normal people might read, I thought maybe I would read a couple of sentences. So this is on page 190, and it's actually the appendix where I tried to figure out how design thinking and strategic design had evolved in business. And so one of the skills of strategic design is to take stock identify values to filter information, and start to work for elegant solutions that balance diverse interests while making the result look obvious. In an age when more information is added to the public record in a week than Adam Smith had available in his lifetime, the skills and knowledge of strategic design and design thinking will be increasingly essential. Then I have a little takeaway chapter. It's okay, Trevor's going to another event. he's double, triple, quadruple booked. Thanks, Trevor. Take care. So I had 7 takeaways, but the takeaway that I probably think is the most important is about learning. What is it like to step into something completely unfamiliar? What is it like to take risks and be vulnerable? We know the answer. It's risky, it's frightening, and it's fabulous. It's where learning takes place, and it's where we need to be. Today's leaders need to be designing with 21st century strategies. Old modes of thinking will produce the same old results. There's a new set of skills to be learned. And so I want to end with 5 sort of tips around designed leadership. The first one is just the notion of paying attention to our thinking and problem-solving processes. That I'm pretty process agnostic. I mean, there's many ways of describing all sorts of processes, and certainly design processes. And Ask, Try, Do really came from teaching BComs and realizing that I could remember Ask, Try, Do because it's 1-syllable word, and so could students. And so the idea that Ask is really about research and the discovery stage. Try is really about prototyping, testing, generating ideas, seeing whether they work or not. And Do is actually around the act of making something happen, evaluating it, coming back, and actually often redoing. And in a sense, that's why I don't use the terminology design thinking very much, because it doesn't have that sense of actual action. So paying attention to our thinking and problem-solving processes, because as human beings, I think we have a tendency to get a problem and to think, okay, I got to solve this as quickly as I possibly can, instead of getting a problem and thinking, is this really the problem? And asking questions about all of the unpacking of the problem. I guess the second tip I call slow and fast. And I think there's different paces for designed leadership. Generally it takes time, but sometimes you want to go fast. You need to generate ideas quickly. You need to be in that mode where you're not letting your critical voice slow you down with, oh, that won't work, or oh, I'm not sure. On the other hand, sometimes not so fast is really an important mode. And reflecting is a learned skill that takes time. And so I think that's important. The third thing, and I have a whole chapter on thinking spatially and visually, and it's something that a little gift I try to give to the business students, which is every time they try to explain ideas just using words, the tendency is to make a lot of assumptions, because the meaning of words, for each of us, we may be speaking the same language, and this is a lesson I learned from Dave around his work around the boardroom, is that you can't make assumptions about, we might all be speaking the same language, but words have different meaning to each of us. And what I find is if I get students to actually draw a problem and diagram an idea, then it invites the other folks in the room to say, well, what do you mean by that? Because it is a language that you have to probe. So I really think speaking learning to think and speak visually is important. Then there's the passion piece. There's a lot of talk about human-centered design, and it is important. There's no doubt. Sometimes I get frustrated that the ideals of the world are promoting human-centered design as if this was something new. In fact, built environment designers and many designers have embedded in the idea that people are critical. We're not always successful in our sensibilities in responding to people, but I'm really kind of keen on people getting connected to their passion around what they do in leadership and what they do in design and how that all fits together. The final tip is the idea of continuous learning. And I was fortunate to be at a conference a couple of years ago with Thomas Friedman as the kind of coordinator. It was about the world of work. And he was interviewing Laszlo Bock, who is the former vice president people for Google. And this was 2014, and at the time, Google would have 11,000 applications a day globally. So Friedman said to Bock, so, what are you looking for in your employees at Google? And Friedman actually wrote a great column on this. He said, I'm looking for continuous learners, looking for people that are always asking questions, who are curious, who are totally comfortable with ambiguity, who think in a multi-sectoral sense. And I thought to myself, absolutely. And I'm not sure what our formal educational system does around continuous learning and whether or not, clearly you folks are interested in continuous learning, but how do we embed this? So I'll end basically by thanking all of you. And if I've done my work well in this little book, I guess I hope it should help others understand many of your successes and how to play them forward. And if not, please let me know, because as you know, it's all about continual improvement, asking, trying, and doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I love several things you brought up. I love the idea of a book that's like tapas, because isn't that the way we actually absorb information these days? Reflection, the value of reflection, and the value of doing. You really don't know something till you've done it. It's so true. Do any of you have comments, questions? We have an extra microphone.
It's okay, you can ask tough ones. Former students, you should really be at me.
Former students.
No, it's okay.
It always takes everyone a second.
Oh yeah, no,
After
there's
the shock of
there's a technical term for it. It's called wait time.
At home, I tried to look up your book online and found the table of contents, and I saw you listed Jane Jacobs' ladder. But I was wondering if you could speak more to what you've created with Jane Jacobs.
Sure,
with your
sure.
list. Thanks.
You know what's a bit shocking is that sometimes I have trouble remembering what's in the book. Like Jane Jacobs. No, I do remember. So there's a chapter, the very first chapter actually, is taking 10 principles from the built environment theory space and asking myself, what does this mean for business? And so one of them is around edges and boundaries, for example. One of them is knowing, experience, and place. And I chose one that's called the Jane Jacobs test. And for those of you who are Jane Jacobs aficionados, it's all about eyes on the street. It's all about activity on the edge. And so I started to think about leadership in that way, and how the notion of a kind of leader who has eyes on the street, in other words, their organization, who doesn't stay in their office but actually moves out in the street, and who thinks about actually positioning different activities in an organization in a way that activates the opportunity for people to connect and have ideas. And this is not a new idea, but I thought it was kind of fun to celebrate Jane Jacobs and to suggest that businesses could learn from her. And so that was, I did the same thing with Charles Moore in the sense of how he talks about how he settles buildings into the landscape. And I started thinking, leaders have similar kinds of behavior, can choose to have similar kinds of behavior. So those are a couple of the principles. Peter.
I'm coming.
Oh, you're coming? Okay.
Madame, we will take care of you.
I feel like I'm back in school. Put up my hand. So, in the ask, try, do, there's different competencies in those different categories as you're going through the process. And
Yep.
and not everyone is as good at asking questions as doing. People have different strengths. And I think for myself, I've moved into many different roles in many different situations, working in large organizations and then also working in really small, tiny, resource-strapped organizations where you don't have a lot of people to do everything. And so I've struggled with having to fill lots of roles that I'm not necessarily feel I'm competent in or feel like I have competencies in. And I've always wondered if that makes me not as good of a designer, and that should I be actually trying to grow my strengths in all these different areas, or should I just acknowledge what I'm good at and then bring people in together? Or, and that's kind of, I guess, the default answer is like surround yourself with great people. But should you be trying to improve some of those areas that are deficits for yourself? It depends on your philosophy, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure, yeah. So one of the teaching in Sauder, and it's a course that's called Design Methods for Business Innovation, and Angèle Beausoleil teaches it now as I've moved on to the policy arena. And so when we were thinking about a set of techniques, and especially this course is designed to really bridge theory and practice in Sauder, so that there's a preponderance of theory and not always enough opportunity to think, oh, businesses, how would they apply this? What are their issues? So we generally have teamwork, and now, fortunately, we have a kind of a combination. There's 36 students in the class, 24 are BComs, so there's a little bit of variety, like marketing, finance, etc. But 12 are from the rest of the university. So, because my point to Sauder was, when business students graduate, they don't just get to talk to other business students. They have sociologists, they have engineers, they have designers. So we have a team, and the team works with a company, and generally we ask, okay, what's keeping you awake at night? CEO, and there starts to be a co-creation of a design brief for the term. But we always start with a personal SWOT and a team SWOT. So the personal SWOT being, okay, I'm Peter, now I've graduated, I have a master's degree, and I'm doing all these things, but where are my strengths and weaknesses? Where are my opportunities, and what is a bit challenging? And then the team comes together and shares those personal SWOTs and creates a team SWOT. And this is where the question comes up. Is this an opportunity for me to take leadership that I don't normally take because I need more experience in leadership? Or I've always hated Excel spreadsheets. I guess it's time for me to take the lead on, whatever, the project management, the financials. So I guess my response is it depends on the situation, because I think sometimes it's a huge opportunity to grow and to learn if one has the courage to say, I'm not great at this, but I really want to improve. It probably depends what's at stake. I guess I would suggest that. But I'd always kind of lean towards the, you can do both. You could say, okay, I'm gonna take on something I'm quite strong at, and therefore that gives me confidence to take on the piece that I want to learn about. So, Donna.
I remember one of your first lectures at UBC.
Uh-oh.
I do. I'm one of the former troublemaker students. No. And one of the first lectures, you talked about wearing all these different hats. You had to wear all of these different hats. And I have found, in my own experience, working in certain communities where I'm working with many other leaders, they're very leaderly, and then I have to step in and lead the leaders, that I've had to wear all these various different hats. And that lecture has always stayed with me. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Do you mean De Bono's 6 thinking hats?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
And I still have the book.
You still have the book. Yeah, I mean, it's a great technique to in a sense isolate your thinking for a while, to say, okay, I'm putting the white hat on, that's an objective viewpoint. I'm putting the red hat on, I can be passionate about this, and it's allowed. And I think it's sometimes most useful when, if someone is, every idea that comes up, they say, that'll never work. So to be able to then say, well, instead of finger pointing to them, you can say, well, maybe it's time for all of us to put our yellow hat on and not the black hat. So I think it's a good kind of team potential, for sure. Yeah. The mic is coming.
So you spoke to ambiguity, which
Yes.
many organizations now are beginning to recognize. We're actually hiring for that. But there's a relationship between ambiguity and trust that the solution will emerge. Can you speak to that?
Aha, that's a very good question. For me, that's the usefulness of having a process. So, again, Sauder has a very good system of midterm feedback. So we always get the same feedback from the BCom students midterm. And it's that nobody's telling us what to do. It's totally confusing, and there's no right answers. Like, super not comfortable with any kind of ambiguity. And there's a pivot point that happens, it seems, in their learning, where the ask, try, do starts to give a comfort level of, oh, wait a minute, yes, that isn't clear. Why isn't it clear? Oh, maybe I should use the 5 whys technique, or the 6 universal questions, or I should attempt to clarify. And so that's why I depend on a process, is that if I get stuck, or if I feel like I can't really cope with the tumultuous ambiguity, that I come back to the process. So I think it's when we have incredibly challenging problems and that are systemic, and we don't have any way of tackling them, then I think it's really difficult. But if we can work together with a process, then I think it's easier. But the other thing I'll say is a timeline. I think it's very difficult to have a process that doesn't end. So that, if there's ambiguity, there needs to be some sense of we're moving through the process, and by such and such a time, we will come to some kind of decisions about whatever we're challenged by. I don't know, does that help?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Gord?
Would you like a challenge?
I beg your pardon?
Would you like a real challenge?
Of course.
How could you say no? I'm going to ask it because I'm really interested in your perspective on this.
Sorry?
I'm going to ask it because I'm really interested in your perspective on this, not just from what you've written, but from the world that you live in. And I'm struck that the world you described, the one you grew up in, I feel a nostalgia for it already, because it's the world before Trumpism. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking just about Trump. I'm talking about what he's come to represent in the world that's unfolding. Mm-hmm. And it does seem to me that the assumptions that you're talking about, the leaders of our time, mm-hmm. the tools they can use, the institutions they're in, the world that we thought would unfold, mm-hmm. maybe not. So I'm interested in whether I'm kind of right on that it's a world that's past. And more importantly, what do you see among your students, the leaders you talk to, mm-hmm. The world that maybe we'd prefer to not have to think about?
Yeah. So, I mean, I reflected, I purposely have talked about my past because I think that the lens, for those of you that might read the book, it gives you some insight into the lens of which through which I speak. However, I guess I'd like to think that the principles and the practices of design leadership are actually about the future. They're actually about tackling some of the incredibly challenging times that we're in, and that the idea of applying a strategic design methodology, of applying the notion that we have to be in a different kind of space to solve some of the problems that we are needing to solve, the idea that leaders are mentors and coaches. I think that's even more important now than in maybe the last decade. I think that students are, so the students that I have most contact with now are master's students in the Masters of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And our tagline for that program, which is a marketing tagline, I will admit, but when asked, why did you come to this program? They say, I want to be a global change maker. So the students are coming because they want to change the world we're in. And whether that, in this case, it's working at a policy level. And so I see a lot of hope. Raphael, maybe you want to answer Gord's, I mean, are there challenges? For sure. Are they being Pollyanna about it and kind of saying, oh, no, this isn't happening? No. But are they going to lie down and say, oh, I can't do anything about this? No, they're not. And I don't think the business students are, and I certainly don't think our master's students are. Nor I have a little bit to do with international relations undergrads. They want to be out there making change. Now, is it going to be fast enough? Is it going to be the right kind of change? I don't know. But I have a lot of hope. And it's part of the joys of being at a learning institution, is that you get filled with a lot of energy and a lot of hope. And I think it's, now, do I have a metaphorical velvet box under my desk where I put a lot of challenges? Of course I do. Because you have to get up in the morning and really feel that you can tackle what you can tackle. And so, yeah. What's that? Yes, it's always velvet. It's always purple, too.
Purple, yes.
I think that's it.
Great.
The last challenging question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being for coming at the end of a day. And I'm happy to sign books. Yay. And I only hope I don't do what I did at the last signing, which was somebody who came up to me who I know their name as well as I know mine. I was like, oh my God, what's this person's name? I had to ask her. I had to say, what's your name? So it might happen to me, but some of you I don't know your name, so I'm safe. But then there's the spelling problem. Oh, and then there's the making a mistake problem. I've done that too. Oh. Anyway, thank you so much.